An associate professor of history at Hope College. Prior to his career in higher education, he served in the United States Marine Corps as a communications electronics officer and as an infantry officer in the Marine Reserve. Fred is a graduate of Bowie State University in Maryland. He earned MA and PhD degrees at Kent State University in Ohio. His primary field of study is 19th century American U.S. history, especially the Civil War, but he has many other areas of expertise, including 20th century U.S. military and African history. And of course, now we're learning another area of expertise is the history of the Black church. So with that, this will be the second of the 5 sessions on the history of the Black church. This one will be called Land of the Two Gospels. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fred Johnson.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning, scholars of HASP. It's good to be with you all one more time. And like Tom pointed out, we're looking at the second session today of the history of the Black church, the Land of the Two Gospels. I call it the Land of the Two Gospels because I made in passing reference toward the end of the last class, part 1, I made passing reference to Frederick Douglass. And I call it the Land of the Two Gospels because in his narrative that he wrote in 1845, the first actual telling of his life when he finally escaped from slavery, Frederick Douglass, who lived roughly from February 1818 until 1895, a long, very rich, very challenging, very productive, just amazing life. Frederick Douglass in his narrative talked about the Christianity of America and the Christianity of Christ. Or, as he put it, the gospel of Christ. And then there was the gospel of the United States, or the gospel of America. And as we shall see in a later session, this bifurcation, the way he described this was so spot on correct for the realities and the challenges that were confronting him and African Americans, and frankly, just on a larger scale, Americans of that day trying to figure out what to do with the challenges of the early 19th century, particularly a land where slavery had been established, was thriving, spreading, and becoming more embedded into the national consciousness and culture, to the point where the difficulty of separating slavery from America was on the order of trying to separate wetness from water. At some point, you simply couldn't do it. To think of one was to be the other. And as we mentioned last week, this idea of there being a Black church, I am happy for the Black church. I grew up in the Black church. I am a Black Southern Baptist. The Black church is all I have known most of my life. And I'm glad for the institution. But looking at it from the perspective of Christ, looking at it from the perspective of the Alpha and the Omega, the great I am, he said that there was to be one church. There should not have been a Black church, ideally. But in America, there is a Black church. And as I mentioned to you all last week, we have to ask the question, why did there have to be a Black church in America? And then how was it established? I wanted to take out, last week, we went into the colonial slave codes to lay the foundation, to establish the context. That for however one's going to answer the question about why there had to be a Black church, the answer to that question is deeply rooted in the society in which that church was established. We're not talking about just a neutral situation where Black people decided, of their own volition, because they thought it would be a good idea to go have a Black church. The social conditions of the time, the laws of the time, the culture of the time, the reality of the time, the attitudes of the time, the race-based chattel slavery of the time left people no choice. If they were determined to worship God under the banner of Christianity, and they couldn't do it one way, and they still were determined to embrace Christ and worship Christ in North America, the only way that was left to them was to do it in the Black church. And so that being the case, we then had to ask the question, so then what were those social conditions? What were those attitudes? What were those things that made it necessary to establish that separate institution that flew right in the face of the general overall global Catholic Church, or the Catholicity of the church, that included all peoples, irrespective of their background, their origin, their languages, their race. What made that necessary in America? That's what we have to deal with. And that's how you ended up with a land of two gospels. The paradox of a Black church in a land where there should have been only one church, their paradox, that dilemma, that divergence, that bifurcation, in a worldly sense, in a more human sense, in a more mortal sense, is on a similar scale, presents the difficulty of establishing a land of freedom dedicated to liberty and freedom, a land and a nation dedicated to liberty and freedom that aspires to ideals of freedom and liberty, at the same time that it made room for the tyranny of chattel slavery. It simply cannot be done, or it cannot be done and maintain itself indefinitely. As it maintained itself for quite a long time. But the idea of the Americans trying to establish a nation where they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men to most people means exactly what it says, all men, and we now know in the 21st century, we know all men and all women. But all men and all women necessarily means something absolutely different when every day we go outside and see before our very eyes that there are some men and women who clearly are not included in that. And then you get into the reasons why they're not included. Is it because they're not intelligent enough? Is it because they weren't Christian? At one point, it was because they weren't Christian. But we saw last week that the colonial slave codes got to a point where they said that even if you were baptized and became a Christian, that too was not good enough to ensure your freedom. So then they got down to the brass tacks of it all. It essentially was, this is a nation, this is a colonial society, where if you happen to be Black, if you are an Ethiopian, which was the ancient or the old way of putting it, if you were a Negro, if you were from Africa, if you were a descendant from Africa, Christian or not, born here or not, you were slated for slavery. And from that one slave law in the 1660s that passed that said child follows the condition of the mother, it was a lifelong sentence, which was determined not on the basis of who you are, not on the basis of what you could do or what you knew, but on the basis of the color of your skin. This dilemma of race-based treatment, how people were perceived on the basis of their race, was a poison dropped into the ecosystem early on, and we persist to struggle with it now. It gave America a personality that is still trying to work out. And as early as the American Revolution, this thing begins to show the peculiarities of trying to have fight for liberty, fight a cause, fight to uphold standards of freedom and ideals of liberty, at the same time that you have people within it who are never going to participate in that system, in that liberty, and the benefits of that freedom. During the American Revolution, 5,000, it's estimated 5,000 Black men volunteered and fought on the side of the Continental Army. They did their duty. As I mentioned to you all last week, in 1775, Lord John Dunmore put out a call to African Americans, asking them, or essentially telling them, if you Black slaves will come and fight for the British, because the British, everybody, even in the colonies, expected the British to win. If you come and fight for us, when we win, we'll free you. And the Americans made a similar offer, but it came very, very late in the opening stages of the war. In 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was finally released, it was already a flawed document. What we had to look at is how and why was it such that way? And it has to do with Thomas Jefferson and some things he said about His Royal Highness King George III. And this is a political example of the dilemma, of the paradox, of the inconsistency, of the cognitive dissonance that is going to be plaguing the American experiment, particularly when it came to Christianity and the messages of Christ and the words of Christ that should have been meant for liberation and equality of treatment, that were taken to reinterpret it to do everything else but to achieve that end. Thomas Jefferson, in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he included a passage attacking slavery. And it initiated intense debate among the delegates gathered in Philadelphia in the spring and early summer of 1776. This passage on slavery was the most important section removed from the document. Let me put it plainly. Thomas Jefferson basically put a passage in there where he condemned slavery, and the delegates made him remove it. That passage said as follows: he, King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Now, one might ask, given the fact that the colonies were still at that time part of the British Empire, Jefferson was just as much impugning his colonial brethren as he was the king. But since this was a movement for independence, they decided to go ahead and speak of the king as a separate individual, the British Empire as a separate entity, and they basically foisted this thing upon us that we now are having to live with. This piratical warfare, this international slave trade, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. Watch this language that Jefferson is using. Watch the language being used by this author of the Declaration of Independence and owner of slaves. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. Execrable commerce. In 18th century terms, this is about as damning an indictment of the slave trade and slavery as one could get. And Jefferson was the right man to do it because he was so gifted when it came to words. But the delegates, when they saw this language in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, they made Thomas Jefferson remove it. So here we are, long before the Articles of Confederation, long before the Constitution, already compromises were being made with the system and the institution of slavery. So it was guaranteed that the colonists were about to fight a war for independence and liberty while making room for the tyranny of slavery. Again, maybe one of you all can help me figure it out. I don't know how you can achieve both at the same time, because most people will interpret it either as one or the other. Certainly the slaves saw it as being tyranny. And what did that mean for Christianity? What about the Christian aspect? What about the religious aspect of the American Revolution? Because there were some religious overtones in interpretations of the revolution. For example, in the emerging United States, there was the people who were giving their allegiance to the new Union of States versus the oath they had taken before God to the King of England. Don't forget that the Anglican Church, because of the Anglican Church, the king was the leader of the Anglican Church. For many people inside of the colonies, there was a great deal of dissidence, difficulty trying to figure out, do they take the new oath, give their allegiance to the new Union of States or the United Colonies by breaking their oath to the King of England? Because oaths, of course, are a very important thing. People had to deal with that. They had to wrestle with that. We need to remember that half of Anglican priests in America, they gave up their ministries rather than violate their promise to serve the king. So some people just essentially got out of the ministry altogether. Some supported British forces. For others, they decided that the revolution amounted to a crusade of a type. For example, Richard Jonathan Mayhew, he was the pastor of West Church in Boston. He gave moral sanction to the war. He preached that opposition to a tyrant, that is the British king, was a glorious Christian duty. So here, at least an example of Jonathan Mayhew, we can see that the language of the language of Christianity, the language of religion from the pulpit, he is saying that the British king is a tyrant, and that to resist tyranny, it is correct for Christians in their Christian duty to resist tyrants, in this case, the king. It is a very short leap there, if you're a Black person, to see how that language wouldn't apply to a slaveholder, if in fact tyrants are to be resisted as one's Christian duty. And then John Witherspoon. From 1776 to 1782, he represented New Jersey in the Continental Congress. He served on over 100 committees, and he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. From his point of view, the Revolutionary War had a lasting impact on religion in America. In other words, religion and religious overtone, religious influence was part of the American Revolution, just like strategy in the military and politics was. Millennialists believed that Christ would reign for 1,000 years, and after the victory over Great Britain, people of a certain mindset believed that it was a clear sign of God's partiality for the United States. For those of you, many of you probably are aware of the fact that, for example, Jonathan Winthrop was the one who, as an early colonist, came to America and said that North America, colonial America, it would be like having a city on a hill. A city on a hill that will be a beacon of light and liberty and Christian purity, and a land of opportunity that would draw people from around the world to share in the blessings of American liberty. After the revolution, you have the slow evolution, the rise of the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States, which came from the remnants of the US located Anglican remnants. The Methodists were established, they established an all-American presence in the US. The Presbyterians began viewing their church as American. In other words, the American influence of the Methodists, the Presbyterians, now that America was a separate independent nation, those different denominations began exerting themselves more as an American identity and the American character. Bear with me as I read. The legacy then of the revolution was that religions of the United States were finally united under one banner, American. The next great hurdle for them was the abolition of slavery in the newly independent nation. Now that we have achieved independence from Great Britain, now that the tyranny of the king has been removed, there was within the midst of the new American nation another tyranny, a tyranny that whether you agreed that the king had foisted it upon people or not, that tyranny was there, it was embedded in law, and it was economically profitable. Now, the Revolutionary War will end in 1781, the military phase. The peace treaty will be signed in 1783. Some people have asked, how religious were the founding fathers? I'd like to show you a little video clip.
What role did the Judeo-Christian thought contribute to the formation of our Republican experiment?
Well, yeah, people would have talked about Christianity more, but it was the Old and New Testament. So in that sense, you could say it was Judeo-Christian thought. It was, of course, very, very important, although not so much from the founders. Most of them were not, how should I put it, emotionally religious. Some of them were really anti-religious, like Jefferson. He hated organized religion. Now he got burned a couple of times by making some statements that suggested that he didn't think religion was all that important. And that hurt him in the election of 1800. And so he said, well, I'm going to show myself and some of my close friends that I really am a good Christian. And he cut up the Bible, as you know, and created the Jefferson Bible. What he did was just cut up all those phrases that Jesus used, saying, love thy neighbor as thyself, which is he thought was the central moral message of Jesus, made him the greatest moralist who ever lived. But he did not believe in the divinity of Jesus, divinity of Christ. And
well, let me help Gordon S. Wood out. What Dr. Wood was essentially saying, what he was going to say was that Jefferson was the kind of individual who believed more that Jefferson was more interested in the right of his neighbor to believe in what he wanted to believe in, not so much concerned what they believed in, just the fact that they had the right to believe or have their separate beliefs. Let's just keep going. In 1787, something spectacular happened. Truly, as far as politics goes, as far as the political evolution of nations goes, this was a wonderful event. It was a gathering in Philadelphia for examining the Articles of Confederation. At that time, the foundation, the formal government that the US was being governed by, and we had something called the Constitutional Convention, as depicted by this very famous photograph showing George Washington presiding over the gathering. They met from the spring through early fall, late summer, early fall of 1787. And the preamble to the Constitution that they came up with is worth examining just for a moment. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson made reference to the Creator. In the 18th century, people spoke a little differently about God, especially when they were doing it publicly, than we do today. Today, you hear people very often talking about Jesus Christ being their personal Lord and Savior. People were not that transparent in the 18th century, certainly a lot more formal. So they spoke of providence, they spoke of the Creator. In other words, they spoke of God as being a giant entity, which of course he or she is, but it was very much more in impersonal tones and terms. But from this preamble, it's always struck me that when you look at the 1787 preamble to the Constitution that says, we the people, we must ask some questions. In 1787, who was included in we? In 1787, we did not include Native Americans. We did not include women. We did not include poor whites. We did not include Black people, certainly not Black slaves. There are 3 different clauses in the Constitution that are going to wed that document of freedom to the tyranny of slavery. But in 1787, in the same year that the Constitutional Convention was wrapping up, in the same year, in the same city, something else took place that further showed just how contentious and problematic and diabolical and complex the issue of slavery and especially race in America was going to be in a nation trying to form itself along Judeo-Christian principles that were looked at from a certain point of view. In other words, the gospel said one thing, the American gospel said another thing, or Americans interpreted the gospel in a different kind of way, which ended up being recreating a reality for a land of 2 gospels. In the book, North of Slavery by Leon F. Litwack, the book is North of Slavery by Leon F. Litwack, The Negro in the Free States, 1790 to 1860. If you don't have this book has got some miles on it. It's been out for a while. If you don't have it, it is truly worth getting. But in this book, Leon F. Litwack, that's him right there, he tells of an incident that occurred in Philadelphia in 1787. And it happened at the historic St. George's United Methodist Church. As you can see from this historical marker, St. George's United Methodist Church is America's oldest Methodist church edifice, having been in continuous use since 1769. It was the seat of the first 3 conferences of American Methodism, the first church visited by many of the early British Methodist itinerants, and the first site of the Methodist Book of Concern. One person who was attending this particular church in Philadelphia was an African-American scholar, theologian named Richard Allen. Now, Richard Allen was born into slavery in 1760. His owner was a man named Benjamin Chew, a prominent lawyer and Chief Justice of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. As a child, Richard Allen and his parents and 3 siblings were sold to a Delaware planter. Many people are not aware of the fact that Delaware was a southern state and therefore a slave state right alongside Maryland. Richard Allen recalls in his writings that his owner was a decent slave owner or a decent man. But even so, even though Richard Allen's owner was decent, even so, he went on to say that slavery was nevertheless a bitter pill, even though we had a so-called good master. Now, as often happened in the time of slavery, when owners got into financial troubles, owners, of course, would sell their assets, and human property was part of those assets. So when the owner, Mr. Chu, got into some financial trouble, Richard Allen's mother, along with 3 of his 5 siblings, were sold to pay off debts. I'm gonna just let that hang for a moment, because that all by itself sums up the dilemma that America was already facing. Somehow, even after going through all that, after seeing his mother sold off and 3 of his siblings sold off to pay debts, Richard Allen accepted Christ at the age of 17 and started preaching on the plantation and at local Methodist churches. Now, there's something else that should capture our attention in just a moment to give us some insight into the intractable nature of slavery in America. Richard Allen joined and evangelized friends and neighbors. He and his brothers were attending classes every week and meetings on every Thursday. The white neighbors began to complain to Richard Allen's owner. And the neighbors told Richard Allen's owner that he and his brothers were being indulged too much. In other words, you are treating your slaves too kindly. You are giving them too much freedom. You are treating them too much like human beings. In other words, you are not being hard enough on them. They're not going to know their place. What is it that is giving them this feeling that they're not knowing their place? Richard Allen and his brothers are attending Methodist church meetings, and the neighbors are complaining about that. These guys have converted to Christianity. They're going to Methodist church meetings, and the neighbors are saying there's something wrong with this. And they say that kind of freedom, that kind of liberty to attend church meetings would ruin them as slaves. Friends, if we come down square on the point here, what this means for these particular neighbors, they're saying that the needs of slavery outweigh or are more important than whatever education, whatever kind of spiritual uplift, whatever kind of spiritual growth might be accomplished by Richard Allen and his brothers attending these Methodist meetings. The needs of slavery came first before the cross for these particular neighbors. So Richard Allen and his brothers, seeing that people were complaining about them not doing the duties of a slave, in other words, there's a social expectation that Black people, Black slaves should be acting in a certain kind of way. They weren't acting that way. So Richard Allen and his brothers decided, okay, you know what? We want to keep on going to these meetings. So if we don't want the master to stop us, we better change our behaviors. In other words, we better accommodate the stereotype that people expect of us. So they changed their strategy and became better servants. They became better slaves, so it wouldn't be said that Christianity had ruined them. The belief that Christianity would ruin them. This is why so many slave owners would give a certain type of Christianity to their slaves. Not the Christianity of liberation, not the Christianity that will put the slave on the same level with their owner, but a certain type. This is how each and every one of these kind of compromises is how you, at the end of the day, end up with a second kind of gospel. Not the one proposed or spoken of by Christ, but the one that was perverted, modified to suit the needs of American slavery. In this instance, slavery, this symbol on the left, was a picture that was used very often, a drawing very often in the 18th century to symbolize slavery. I had to make a clarification like this over at the seminary just a couple of days ago, because somebody thought that this particular slide was Black people against the cross. No, this is the system of slavery against the cross. So when the system of slavery, depicted by this Black man in chains, at the bottom it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" When the system of slavery came up against the cross competitively, slavery won. The cross lost. Now, Richard Allen and his brothers, apparently their strategy worked. Richard Allen began preaching whenever possible. He later recalled, "Sometimes I would awake from my sleep preaching and praying." Man, very devoted to the message of Christianity that he had gotten. He eventually converted his so-called owner to Christianity, and the owner allowed Richard Allen to purchase his freedom. Now you know what? So, someone's going to allow you to purchase a freedom that should never have been denied in the first place, but it's the 18th century. Let's keep moving. In 1781, as a free man now, as a person that has bought his own freedom, Richard Allen began traveling along Methodist circuits, because in the 18th century, it was nothing unusual at all for especially Methodist preachers and Baptist preachers to be traveling what they call the circuit. So from town to town, village to village, they would go through preaching, and very often somebody would put them up or they would give them money, and that's how they supported themselves. In 1781, Richard Allen began traveling on the Methodist preaching circuits in Delaware and the surrounding states. He said, my usual method was when I would get bare of clothes to start traveling and go to work. In other words, when he ran out of money, he would find a job doing whatever he could. And he said, my hands would minister to my necessities. So doing manual labor, he would put himself to work, get enough money, and continue on with his preaching. Francis Asbury was a very, very prominent person in the Methodist faith at that time. As Allen continued preaching, prominent Methodist leaders like Francis Asbury made sure that he had places to preach. And in 1786, Allen finally made his way back to Philadelphia and joined St. George's Methodist Church. And there, as a Black leader in that church, he established a leadership that began drawing more and more African Americans, free Blacks in the city of Philadelphia to come to prayer services, and they attracted dozens of Blacks. Now, another person that arose to leadership alongside Richard Allen was, let's just say, a co-laborer named Absalon Jones. Now, Richard Allen was so good at what he did. He was so good at preaching that as more and more Black people started joining St. George, the church leadership, the white church leadership, decided that they needed to segregate the Black people and the white people. In other words, Richard Allen's preaching was so good. And here he was preaching at 5 a.m. services, 5 a.m. as in 5 o'clock in the morning. He was getting people to get up at 5 a.m. in 1786 and 1787 to come and hear him preach. And such were the numbers that the church fathers decided that they needed to separate people. As Black attendance at the church increased, so too did race prejudice. When the ruling body at St. George decided that Blacks should be segregated and seated in a newly constructed balcony. So here we have a situation. Richard Allen is out here preaching his heart out. He's preaching at the 5 a.m. service. He's already preaching at a service where not very many people are going to attend anyway. Black folks know that's one of the few services that they probably can attend, so they go. Then their numbers get to a point where the church leadership decides, you know what, this is still too much. They build a balcony and tell them they got to sit up there. And so they have segregated services. Something's in operation at this point. It is not the philosophy, it is not the words, it is not the spirit of Christ. This is American society and American culture that has invaded the church and determined how people are going to be treated, how they're going to interact, and where they're going to be seated. This is all about culture. This is all about race. This is all about politics. This is all about economy, and having very little, if anything, to do with the words of Christ, at least the words of Christ that Richard Allen was preaching. And then, as Leon F. Litwack tells the story, something happened in November 1787. Again, the same year that the Constitutional Convention convenes and the document is agreed upon, and they send it out to the states for ratification. Let me read here from North of Slavery. An incident in Philadelphia helped to launch the independent Negro church movement in the North. Two prominent Negro leaders, Richard Allen and Absalon Jones, and several other friends entered the St. George Methodist Episcopal Church for a regular Sunday service. Large numbers of Negroes had been drawn to this church and had been permitted to occupy comfortable seats on the main floor. But the increasing popularity of St. George's finally prompted church officials to announce that henceforth Negroes would be expected to sit in the gallery. Now, the truly inartful way of describing the gallery, the balcony. It was not at all unusual for people to call that what they called nigger heaven. Now, aware of the new seating arrangement, Allen, Jones, and the other Black people took seats in the front of the gallery. So they had been sitting on the main floor with the regular worshipers. Then when their numbers got to be too big, they were told to move upstairs. They moved upstairs and sat at the front so they could see the church services and overlook all the places they had previously occupied. What I'm not sharing with you all is that Leon F. Litwack also says that prior to this, some of the white members of the church had begun buying up pews and reserving them for themselves or their families or their friends, and saying that Black people couldn't sit in the pews. So even if they weren't, they did have room. If you didn't own the pew in the church, you couldn't sit there. So they were basically, by one means or another, by decree from the church leadership or by economic activity in the church, by people buying up pews, they were being told that they could not sit on the main floor. The church authorities had actually reserved an even less conspicuous place for the Negro worshipers in the rear of the gallery. Let's recap. You all are too prominent. You all are an eyesore. So we want you to move upstairs. They moved upstairs. They sat in the front of the balcony. Then they said, you still can be seen. So we want you to sit in the rear of the balcony. And they soon made this quite apparent. On this one particular Sunday, as Richard Allen and Absalon Jones and the other Black people were upstairs in the balcony on their knees praying, he said, we had not been long upon our knees, Allen later recalled, before I heard considerable scuffling and low talking. I raised my head. This man is in the middle of praying to God the Father, the Alpha, the Omega, the great I am. He's in the middle of praying to God. He has to raise his head and he sees one of the church trustees, having hold of the Reverend Absalon Jones, pulling him up off his knees and saying, you must get up. You must not kneel here. This man is praying to his creator, the same guy that allegedly created the guy that's trying to pull him up off his knees. So there is Richard Allen looking at Absalon Jones, his co-laborer for this small congregation of Black people in this church who have been kicked from downstairs, upstairs. They're made to move to the back of the balcony and they go to pray. And there's someone literally jerking them up off their knees saying, you can't pray here. Absalon Jones thereupon requested that the officials wait until the prayers had been completed. In other words, can you look, come on, I'm praying to God. Can you wait? Can you at least wait till I get through praying? When the trustees persisted, however, and threatened forcible removal, Absalon Jones asked them, could you at least wait until I'm through praying to God? They said, stop now or we will remove you by force. And Richard Allen said, we all went out of the church in a body and they were no more plagued with us. Scholars of HASP, let's do a little bit of a word study here, because Richard Allen, Richard Allen was not a man to use words very loosely or imprecisely. When he said that we went out of the church in a body and they were no longer plagued with us, he uses the word plagued because based upon how they were treated, they perceived themselves, the way they were treated just like somebody would treat a disease, someone who is a plague, someone who's undesired, someone that you want to get rid of at all costs, a cancer upon, a threat to the community, a sickness upon the body politic. So your very presence is going to cause disruption. It's a threat. It's going to make people sick. It's going to leave people revolted. No one wants a plague, not smallpox, not bubonic, not AIDS, not coronavirus. Nobody wants a plague like that. That's exactly how they were made to feel, though. And so he says, they were no more plagued with us. And then he goes on to say, in fact, we were filled with fresh vigor to get a house erected to worship God in. They went out and they made the decision to build their own house of worship. In this instance, just as American colonial society made the decision to embrace and codify and deeply root slavery through the slave codes, just like compromise for slavery was made in the Declaration of Independence by forcing Thomas Jefferson to take out language condemning slavery, because if the language had been kept in there, that would have meant that the revolution was as much about fighting for the elimination of slavery as it was about fighting for American independence, but he took it out, so it's just about American independence, keeping slavery. And just like room was made for slavery in the original Constitution with 3 separate clauses, compromise after compromise after compromise, politically, now a major compromise has been made for slavery. Unity in Christ came up against hate, and hate won. In 1793, now 6 years into their journey of establishing a separate Black church, the African-American congregation led by Richard Allen and Absalon Jones, like the rest of Philadelphia, was caught in the grip of a yellow fever epidemic. People will not actually know where yellow fever comes from, and there won't be a cure for it until the late 19th, early 20th century. In fact, right around the time of the Spanish-American War. But during this epidemic, the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, to put a fine point on it, was devastating. It wiped out entire sections. If you've seen pictures or news reports of New York City in the early part of the coronavirus pandemic, you see pictures of Times Square that are empty. I have friends of mine from New York City that say that the city simply was like a ghost town. New York, which is always alive and people everywhere all the time, 24 hours a day. New York, imagine streets quiet. It feels eerie. It feels strange. It looks apocalyptic. Philadelphia in 1793 was the same way, with dead people on the streets, dead people needing to be removed, and people were understandably afraid. In that pandemic, though, in that time, Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers, approached Richard Allen and Absalon Jones and asked them to mobilize the Black community and help Philadelphians survive a yellow fever epidemic. They didn't know how yellow fever came, how it was transmitted, how people got it. The medical technology at the time was not going to figure out that the vector, the transmitting agent for yellow fever, was a mosquito. People are correct to think that it's a tropical disease. People are correct to think that fetid water or unsanitary conditions all have something to do with it, but they're not going to bring all that together in 1793. But what they do conclude is that yellow fever is a tropical disease, and that Black people coming from Africa, a tropical region, must have some type of natural defense against it. So Dr. Benjamin Rush asked Richard Allen and Absalon Jones to mobilize the Black community to help Philadelphians survive the yellow fever epidemic. Allen and Jones did as they were asked. And then rumors began to circulate that Black people were allegedly plundering and profiteering from the disease. In a more rude way of putting that is, Black people are thieves and can't be trusted. And they're using this crisis, this emergency, to engage in the thieving and plundering ways. In this instance, trust came up against hate. We need to remember Dr. Rush came to Absalon Jones and Richard Allen. He came to them. And then there was the opprobrium. Then there were the rumors, all the negative castigation. Trust came up against hate, and hate won again. In their defense, Richard Allen and Absalon Jones published a document entitled A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People During the Late Awful Calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793, and a refutation of some censures thrown upon them in some late publications. We all know, we have seen in our own time, not recent history, never mind recent history, we've seen in recent weeks and months the devastating consequences of conspiracy theories. And here you have an entire community of people who've had their reputations impugned, conspiracy theories abounding about their being thieves and scoundrels and being corrupt. Later on, the conspiracy theories about Black people somehow being more prone to spreading diseases and so forth, that would come later on, although they were already in circulation and formulating in people's minds. And the mere belief that Black people were somehow naturally immune, especially immune or exempt from getting yellow fever, as it turned out, there were many Black people that ended up with yellow fever and died as well. So the mere assumption that being from a tropical area or being descended from tropical people from a tropical location in the world, that proved to be, well, fallacious. But Richard Allen and Absalon Jones were moved to have to write this document, a narrative of the proceedings of the Black people during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793, and a refutation of some censures thrown upon them in some late publications in defense of themselves. And it was a defense of the Black community and a documentation of their heroic efforts. In other words, not only is this not true, we're going to outline for you, we're going to chronicle for you exactly what we did to fight against these rumors. And again, as I mentioned, we have seen in our own time how hard it is to fight a conspiracy, a lie, even with facts and truth, particularly when people are so invested in believing the lie. So if you're a Black Philadelphian in 1793, what do you do? What do you do when you're not good enough to sit in the house of God with your white brothers and sisters, when people believe that you're somehow genetically or naturally predisposed by nature to be a carrier or immune to a disease that's killing so many other people? What do you do to fight against that? And it already had infiltrated and infected the church. At least yellow fever was a bona fide disease. What do you call the disease that caused people to tell folk to move upstairs to nigger heaven and then doesn't let them pray? What do? How do you fight that? Who do you appeal to when you've already been praying to God and that's not working either? To answer the question, how do you end up with the Black church? This is how you end up with the Black church. You need to have a society that prioritizes many things other than Christianity, which embraces all people, all walks of life, all languages, no matter men and women, young and old, all people under the banner of Christ. You need to have a society that's going to make exceptions to that. You're going to have the society that's going to do what it wants to do as opposed to what Christ wants to do in order for you to have a Black church. Now, once you have that established, then you can begin your study of Black theology, Black liberation theology, Black gospel, because from that kind of social environment, those kind of social conditions, those kind of social forces and pressures and injustices, that's how you end up with gospels. That's how you end up with preaching that identifies with Exodus and freedom and a God who's going to sit high and look low. That's how you get those kind of sermons from people that are going through that kind of stuff in society, because they are preaching to the immediate needs of the oppression that they're living up under. That's why you get a Black church. That's why you have to have a Black church all the way up into the 21st century. Later on, Richard Allen and Absalon Jones, they got some assistance from, ironically enough, George Washington, first president of the United States. He purchased a piece of land at 6 and Lombard Streets in Philadelphia, bought an old blacksmith shop. They created a meeting house. And the Reverend John Dickens of the St. George Church, where they were thrown out of, or basically walked out of, he suggested that the new church be called Bethel. It was called Bethel AME. Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. The AME denomination, African Methodist Episcopal Church, endures to this very day. My home church in Grand Rapids, Messiah Missionary Baptist Church, sits right next door to an African Methodist Episcopal Church. By 1805, Richard Allen's congregation had grown to 457. The church expanded with 2 lots. And even though the church was still technically part of the predominantly white Methodist Episcopal Church, the Bethel congregation limited its membership to the descendants of the African race in an attempt to retain autonomy, that is control over their day-to-day affairs, and also a place where people could come and be relatively assured that they would not be treated with indignity, insult, or humiliation. Not when people are getting up to come and worship God. By 1816, Bethel's 1,300 member congregation joined other Black congregations that were established in Baltimore, Maryland, in Salem, in New Jersey, and Attleboro, Pennsylvania. They all began to form a network of AME churches along New England and along the Eastern Seaboard. And Richard Allen was eventually named as the first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1817, by 1816, 1817, there was a movement afoot in the United States to try and find a solution to what in the 20th century will be called the Negro Problem. Black people in the South who were enslaved were not seen, or they might have been a nuisance, they were troubling, they didn't work ever hard enough as slave masters wanted them to, but free Blacks were seen to be either as an anomaly, an eyesore. It was rumored, and I emphasize it was rumored, another conspiracy. It was rumored that they were somehow detrimental to society, that they were lazy, that they were on the public dole, that they were not contributing anything. And if anything, Black people were going out of their way, tooth and nail, day and night, moment by moment during the day, to prove the opposite of all those stereotypes. But again, how do you disprove a negative? Particularly when there's so many who are willing to believe it. So a movement was established called the American Colonization Society. The belief in the early decades of the 19th century was this: look, Black folks are never going to get the kind of equal treatment in America that any normal person would want. And they're generally not wanted here anyway. So the solution by people, and I say this with great sincerity, because there are people of goodwill and great sincerity who wanted to do a good thing. The solution was to send them back to Africa. This will be just one of many attempts to literally remove Black people from the United States. The American Colonization Society was formed to send Black folks back to Africa. Now, that's a simple way of putting it. Black people who were fighting for abolition and abolitionists saw this as being a very cynical attempt to expand slavery. In other words, if you remove Black people, free Blacks from America, Black slaves who were never going to stand a chance of being free, would never have an example of a free Black person to make them disgruntled and make them desire something that was never going to be within range of a possibility for their lives. Black people were always going to be that reality. There was going to always be a threat to the slaveholding system, because slaveholding in America said that all Black people should have been slaves. Well, then if that's true, how do you explain thousands of Black people, small in number, but thousands nonetheless, in a place like Philadelphia, who are not slaves? So it makes those who are enslaved unhappy with their situation. And the last thing that you want on your hands in the 19th century is an unhappy, dissatisfied, hostile slave. So in 1817, representatives from the American Colonization Society came to Bethel AME, and they held a meeting where approximately 3,000 people of African descent. A proposal was put forward about people going back to Africa. And a vote was taken, and they rejected the vote to a person. Those 3,000 individuals essentially said with their collective voice, no, you don't get to force the migration of my ancestors 6, 7 generations ago, because it had been at least that long, by 1817, 6-7 generations ago. You don't get to do that. Come over here and establish a society where they're working for you or at a minimum side by side with you to build a land that's beginning to show some promise and some wealth and some forward advancement. It's looking like it's going to be the place to be, a destination that people want to come to, not go away from. You don't get to take my life, those are my children, my blood, my sweat, and all my tears, and then say, well, I don't need you anymore. And they agree with them. This was a tough place to be. It was not desirable at all. But as bad as it was, we have sunk our lives and our effort and our will and our sweat and our tears and our blood into this enterprise, and you don't get to just rob us of that. So we're staying right here. They rejected it to a person. Now, there were some who did go to Africa and settle in a new place that became known as Liberia. And Liberia has settled right alongside of it Sierra Leone, which was a British colony. The interesting thing about Liberia is that the African Americans who settled in Liberia, to show you how pernicious this idea was in the 19th century and how Christianity was twisted into a kind of ideology that was anything but Christianity in the 19th century. African Americans were sent to Africa in the 19th century, or went to Liberia in the 19th century. In addition to wanting to get away from American oppression, many of them went with the intent and were told, you can go there and Christianize your barbaric, uncivilized brethren and bring them into the fold. So they were sent out, many of them went as missionaries to go in Christian Africans who were presumed to be unchurched or having no faith system at all. And I think during the Q&A, during session one question was, well, did Africans who were brought to America, did they have any kind of a faith system? Were they Christians? There were some among them. Many of them were Muslim, though. And I mentioned to you all during the Q&A the last time that those who came here, who had converted to Islam, the Islam being one of the three religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And all three of those, they have written texts that go along with them. And when it came to the Quran, many people, if you're going to really study the Quran, you have to know how to read. And at a minimum, you got to know how to speak Arabic. So these were not illiterate, unintelligent people. In other words, they were multilingual, they were multiliterate. But these African Americans go to a West African zone and region. They established the nation of Liberia. It's a derivation of the word liberty, or from the word liberty. And here is what to me is the supremely tragic part of the story. These African Americans are so imbibed, they are so acculturated, they have been so conditioned by the American perspective on doing things. Not only are they going to civilize Africans, not only are they going to Christianize Africans, they go and do to indigenous Africans in the area of Liberia the same thing that Europeans did to Native Americans in North America. That is, they land there, they take the best land, they take the best of everything and create a two-tier society and establish literally a system of slavery on those Africans. That system of slavery is going to result in a scandal along the island of Fernando Po in the early 20th century. This seed of hostility that is planted in the 19th century with people who are called the settlers, the Black Americans that leave the United States and go to Africa and establish the nation of Liberia, they're called settlers, or they're called Americo-Liberians. And they are deeply resented. The resentment against them is profound. I'll share this with you, then we'll transition to some Q&A. I was on a Voice of America contract with the company back in the mid-1980s. And one of the things that we had to do is go around the world and look at Voice of America, radio stations, and relay stations. Because I was a communications officer in the Marine Corps, I was cut out for that kind of job. So we were looking at, civil facilities. And of course, I was looking at antennas and transmitters and all this other sort of stuff. One of the areas that we went to was Carysburg, Liberia, just outside of Monrovia. Now, the Liberian Civil War had not started yet, but it was just beginning. The person who was in charge of the Liberian government at that point was a man named Samuel K. Doe. Samuel K. Doe was what they called an indigenous or a native Liberian. He wasn't one of the American Liberians. He wasn't one of the settlers. Samuel K. Doe in 1978 overthrew the American Liberian government, and for the officials that were remaining from that government, he dragged them all out to the beach, had them stripped down to their underwear, tied them to poles, and shot them via firing squad.
Oh my gosh.
That's how deep the resentment persisted into the 20th century. We're talking about from 1817 to 1978. Samuel Doe, like a lot of these leaders, promised open elections, fairness, opportunity. He just became another petty dictator on the African continent. But by the time we got there in 1986 to do this site survey analysis of the Carysburg relay station, the Liberian Civil War was already underway. There was an incident when I was there where a man from one of the neighboring countries, I think when I got the report, it was a man from Guinea who was trying to cross into the border for a delivery or something. He was speaking a language the Liberian guard could not understand him, so he just shot him on the spot. People were already being disappeared. Now, there was a Liberian guy named Adolphus Shannon. And the thing that you'll notice about Liberia is that they have very American sounding names. Their flag is red, white, and blue. Their capital is Monrovia, named after the American president, James Monroe. Their currency is called the Liberian dollar. And for decades, they were looked upon as being an American outpost in West Africa. They were good for America during the Cold War because our antenna were pointed right toward the Soviet Union, where America could broadcast news and weather and sports, anything that would help to deconstruct Soviet propaganda. And there was a man named Adolphus Shannon that I got to be pretty good friends with. And Adolphus Shannon invited me into his village to have dinner with him. And I asked my team leader, I said, Mel, Adolphus has invited me to come into the village with him. Well, we had very strict orders to not leave the compound. So I asked Mel the first time and he said, I wouldn't advise it. Then I asked Mel a second time and he said, okay, you know what? He said, Fred, understand that if you go, there's a civil war starting here. If you go and something happens, we're not responsible for you. I said, okay, got it. I went, it was the end of the day. I got into Adolphus's car. We drove into his village. By the time we got to his village, it was way, way, way far from the compound. By the time we got there, the sun had set. It was so black. If you have never been on the African continent and haven't seen an African night, you have not seen darkness until you've seen an African night. It was so dark. No light pollution whatsoever. We went inside his house. The place was lit up with candles. His wife was very gracious. She sent out this meal that, you might have thought that they were getting visiting royalty. We had a great time. And about 1/3 of the way through the meal, I had this odd feeling. And I looked around and I saw every window in Adolphus's house, the windows were filled with faces. I said, who are these people? Adolphus said, they're all the neighbors from the village. They've come to see you. I said, see me for what? They said they heard that you're visiting. I said, but why do they want to see me? He said, they had come to see one of the descendants. That was the first feeling. Then after we finished eating, we went out and sat on what I guess would have been his front porch. And we were standing out there. Now the moon had come up. And again, if you've never been in Africa, you haven't seen a moon until you've seen an African moon. It was the biggest moon I'd ever seen. And it was the moonlight was just everywhere. And then Adolphus pointed out down from the little pathway in front of his house, there was a crowd of people there. You could just see them. And they slowly came into view. And then they came right up to the front of the house. And it was this massive sea of people standing there in front of me and him. I didn't know what to think of it. And he leaned over and whispered to me, he said, you must go to them. And I said, go to them for what? He said, you must go to them. And I can't tell you all why I did this. I was in a place I didn't know anything could have happened to me, but I walked out there into the midst of those people, and there were hands reaching out and touching my arm, touching my shoulders, touching my back. People started crying. You could hear them softly weeping. And then I didn't know what to make of it until finally I heard one of them, until I finally came up upon this old man who was the village griot, the rememberer, the elder of the village. And he looked at me and took me by my shoulders, and he said, my son, you have returned to us. He looked at the rest of the villagers and he said, this is a child of one of the stolen ones. You hear me? He said, this is a child of one of the stolen ones. And that's when I lost it. We all were bawling together. I felt like in that moment, 300 years of a history that I only felt in my blood, finally it closed full circle. This is a child of one of the stolen ones. And I tell you, that's one of the more amazing experiences of my life. But it made so much sense that these people, somehow they knew that something had been taken from them. And I knew that something had been taken from me and us. And in that moment, it all came together for that brief moment, meeting relatives that I never would have known about. Relatives in a very broad cosmic sense. But that's what happened to the people who took up the offer to go back to Liberia. And the establishment of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the reasons for it. And the social conditions that made it necessary are how you ended up with a land of the two gospels. By the time Frederick Douglass is born in 1818, that land of the two gospels is already established. By the time he becomes a man and writes his narrative in 1845, that land of the two gospels is going to be fully functioning, and Frederick Douglass and others will feel nothing but revulsion for it. Not Christianity, but the Christianity practiced American style. That's what we'll talk about next time. I will now take your questions.
Oh, whoops, sorry, I forgot to unmute. I have one from Peter, Fred. As the Black churches formed and started to develop their own liberation theologies, did the white church leaders try to control the message or threaten Black leaders to preach the white owner's gospel?
Yes and yes.
I figured. Okay. Let's see. That's the only one I have submitted so far. People feel free to type one into the chat if you have anything else. I think it looks and sounds like a lot of you out there are like me. You're a little bit left speechless after listening to Fred. A lot to digest. But we do have 15 minutes or so left. So if you don't want to type it in and you want to unmute yourself, please feel free to do so.
I could just stand here looking at you all. You look so good. It's fun to look at you.
Go ahead, Brad. Right.
Fred, I had heard the history of the founding of Liberia many times, but I don't think I ever heard it framed in that fashion.
You mean relative to sending people back to
get rid of them? Yeah, I think the way it was the first time I recall it, I actually used to collect Liberian stamps in a very serious manner, and it was supposedly a grand, glorious gift. You know, the founding of this, the giving of this country to these people.
Well, you know, Brad, actually you're correct, but you know, that would have been actually what you're saying would have been exactly consistent with the way the Liberian experiment was sold. Because I mean, the thing that we have to wrap our minds around is the fact that, you know, you might think to yourself, well, if you're a Black person in 1816, 1817, given the reality of the time, why wouldn't you go back? Well, you know, for the same reason that some people in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the Balkans War stayed there instead of immigrating. It was home. Some people choose to stay behind because they, as bad as things were, it was still where their relatives were. It's all they knew. And just as you point out just now, a grand gift can be given to these people. Well, embedded within the language and statement like that of the 19th century, the idea that people had the arrogance to think that they could just give land that they'd never been to another group of people who never been there. Because to do that, you had to dispossess the land of the people who are there and grant to the people who are going some type of authority and imprimatur of cosmic ordination or cosmic predestination to own the land. It's called manifest destiny, just going east. So it's problematic from the very beginning.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we also have just a comment thanking you, Fred, for sharing such a powerful, moving story about your experience in Liberia. And then a question asking if you'd like to comment on the Baptist churches, North and South.
I will get to the Baptist churches the next time if you don't mind.
Okay, great.
Because there are some denominations that bear greater burden for what happened to the perversion of the Christian message, the Christianity of Christ.
Mm.
And I think we pointed out during the Q&A the last time that even the Quakers had debates about slavery and whether or not it was appropriate. But the Quakers, I mean, all things considered, the Quakers were probably one of the more progressive communities inside of the United States, North America. But when it came to the Baptists and the other Protestant denominations, yeah, it was pretty tough going for them as far as deciding over slavery. And we know this because Kim in the 1830s and but particularly the 1840s, a lot of these denominations were split along north-south lines on the issue of slavery.
Mm. Complicated. Okay.
Brad,
Yes.
early on in your talk today, you talked about with Thomas Jefferson and the original documents, and then the pressure to remove the elements related to slavery,
Right.
which I kind of refer to as doing the right thing versus self-interest, which is a theme that tends to repeat itself throughout history, even just to look at U.S. history. Could you kind of comment on that? Because even if you fast forward to 2021, as you look at that whole, the real tug, the real divisiveness that comes, but also the struggle of doing the right thing versus self-interest.
Well, doing the right thing versus self-interest, doing the right thing usually involves, not always, but usually involves having courage and integrity. And self-interest, particularly economic self-interest, and economic self-interest usually goes hand in hand with power. Well, if someone is going in a competition of courage and integrity versus self-interest, especially economic and power, courage and integrity very often lose out to, not so much because it's the fault of courage, but it's expediency. What do people want? Now, Thomas Jefferson wanted to do the right thing. He was, I try to, like a lot of scholars, I try to understand Jefferson. How can you write these words and mean them? And Thomas Jefferson meant those words when he wrote them in the Declaration. But then he's owning slaves. And this is not to take my 21st century perspective and impose it on him. I'm not trying to make Jefferson be anything other than he was, a man of the late 18th century. But since there were others in the late 18th century, like William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, Grenville Sharp, who also fought against slavery, that says to me that I'm not somewhere out the pocket by thinking that it would have been unusual or other people would have been also opposed to that system. Thomas Jefferson, as a politician, as an intellectual, was also aware, as we will put it today, politics being the art of the possible. There's what you want, then there's what you can get done. And what you want may be to abolish slavery and lay it at the king's feet for fault, but can you then get on board the southern colonies, which you absolutely must get on board with the revolutionary experiment to fight the British. To fight the revolution, the American Revolution without the southern colonies You're not going to win. That's why they went and got George Washington to be commander of the Continental Army. George Washington was from Virginia. He was a slaveholder. He was prominent. He had experience in the French and Indian War. And if you get Virginia, we need to also remember that Virginia during this time, Virginia is a tremendously large colony. If you get Virginia to come along, the rest of the southern colonies will come right with them. That's exactly what happened. And so rather than jeopardize the revolution, Jefferson took out the language on slavery and drafted a document that still stands the test of time today as far as being a wonderful exposition of aspiration for liberty and freedom. But then there's been embedded within it this tragedy by absence. And so what you see today, as you were asking your question, Ben, the thing that comes to mind most, I just speak for myself, most recently of a lack of courage and integrity is January 6th and everything that happened after that. Because I saw it with my own eyes what happened, and people are asking me to disbelieve what I saw and think that it was something else. Well, all right, you can do that. But there's not much courage and integrity in it.
I've got a question.
I appreciate one follow-up comment. I appreciate your insight on that, because I think what we're all looking for, no matter where you fall on that issue, is being able to find some threads that you've just woven through to help us understand what was happening in the late 18th century, to help us understand what's happening in the early 21st century. We're all trying to figure out and understand why decisions are made and not lose hope in all of us ultimately doing the right thing. Thank you.
You know what? I'll say this very quickly. I remember telling my campaign staff during the first congressional run, I said, you know what? I would rather run a campaign of integrity and lose than to win one where I'm punching below the belt and going negative just to win. And I said, look, let's say if I do win and I get in and I vote on something in my conscience, I know it's the right thing to do, and I'm putting country first and people above party and any ideology. If I do that and people bounce me out, I say, you know what? I'll live with that. Because when I have my last few breaths, I don't want to be having to confront, where I failed myself, not to mention failed God, by taking the expedient, more convenient route. That usually ends up, having you crash into a brick wall. And I just don't do that. Plus, I can't stand cowards. I'll stop.
I've got a question about the AME. How widespread is the AME in the United States today? Do you know?
I don't know the numbers, John, but I know that I've seen AME churches. They have AME churches down in Georgia. They have them in the South. They have them on the West Coast. It's across the United States.
I also have a question.
They're a very well established, very well represented denomination. Kim, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Many free blacks were captured and sent back into slavery. Do you have any information of Richard Allen fearing the loss of his freedom?
I don't have any information on that, but that question shows a lot of insight, Kim, because of this. Every black person who escaped the slavery, and every free black knew that at any moment, that let me put it this way, that they were always on borrowed time.
Right.
Okay. Now, the 1787 Constitution has an Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3. That's called the Fugitive Slave Clause, which essentially says that if you're a slave in South Carolina and you escape to Pennsylvania or New York, a non-slave state, Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3 says, look, I don't care what the laws in New York say. As far as South Carolina is concerned, you're still a slave. And if someone, doesn't say your owner, anyone, any white person comes and says, Kim, you're mine, that's it. The law has to abide by that according to the Constitution. Now, there'll be another fugitive slave, an update on the Fugitive Slave Clause in, I think it's 1794 or 1793, and also an even stronger Fugitive Slave Clause in 1850 after California entered the Union as part of the Compromise of 1850. So what that means then is, if you were a black person in America in the 19th century and you wanted to really be free, truly be free, in order for you to be free in America, that means you got to go to Canada.
Mm.
Because
But
as
would they
long
have
as
even been able to get into Canada?
you would have been able to get into Canada, you could cross, if you're a runaway, you can go through Detroit and cross the Detroit River into Windsor.
Mm.
They have several free black settlements over there. I'll be trying to get over there for users to see some of them. They're wonderful restorations. But you either do that or you take your chances in America. I think I mentioned to you all last week, Frederick Douglass, after he escaped from Baltimore and settled down in New Bedford, then he went on a speaking tour. He had to go to Europe with the urging of William Lloyd Garrison and raise money over there to finally pay off his owner in Maryland, who still demanded that Frederick Douglass owed him his labor. That's why Frederick Douglass said that he had committed a crime by stealing his head and his arms and his legs that his owner still felt belonged to him. So man's got to go overseas, raise money to buy this guy, to finally leave him alone. We call it today an economic restraining order. So no, you're not free in America. You're not free in America. And the thing is, and here's the other thing, Charles, this is the last thing I'll say about this. If you're a black person in America, if you're free, just like for those of you that saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, you saw what happened to Solomon Northup. This man was free. He was kidnapped, sold into slavery, and such is the low social position that black folks have. You have no civic identity. You are not allowed to sit on juries. You're not allowed to charge white people with anything, any kind of crime, except in very, very rare instances. This man didn't even have the legal authority to advocate for his own freedom. He was black. Therefore, when somebody said he was a slave, everybody agreed with that. There was nothing he could do about it. He spent 12 years in that condition. It was a very tenuous sort of situation. So I have sat back and asked myself for years, how did these people survive under these conditions? Knowing every day that something could happen like this. The emotional and psychological stress, that, and how did that emotional psychological stress manifest physically? Because we know now that emotional and psychological stress has a physical manifestation. I don't know how they did it.
Professor Johnson, are you saying then that even when Frederick Douglass bought his freedom, he was at some risk of being recaptured? I mean, somebody could claim that he's still really a slave. Did that happen? Is that what you're saying? That sometimes free blacks were brought back into slavery?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, in Frederick Douglass's case, it would have been less so because he was very prominent.
Right.
However, there were those that had bounties on his head. Frederick Douglass was run out of communities on more than one occasion, and they wanted to have his head on a pike.
Yep. Thank you.
Tom, you were also asking, and I don't know, Fred, if you're going to be touching on this in another week, but if you are planning to talk about the relationship between the Catholic Church and slavery at all.
I will talk about that later on.
Okay, great. And
I
then
just want to do some more research on that. I want to speak on it, but I want to get more information on it.
okay. Another question from Peter, just that many white evangelical churches and black evangelical churches today preach different gospels. This person believes, as you do, that Jesus wanted to form just one church. Would you reflect on what the Church of Jesus Christ should do today to bring the white and black churches together? It's a big one.
I'll tell you what my pastor did back in Ohio. I was going to a church called the Arlington Church of God, and it was the largest black congregation in Akron. The largest white congregation was led by a guy named Newt Larson. His church is called the Chapel. Now, Pastor Fowler, my pastor, and Newt, they were very good friends. And, they went to all the pastoral events, and the prayer breakfast. This went on for years. And, I don't know how it happened, Kim, but Pastor stood up on one Sunday in the pulpit and said that he and Newt were just sitting around talking one day and realized, you got a predominantly white church, the biggest white congregation in Akron. I got the biggest black congregation. And yet we've been kind of like, motoring along like that's the way it's supposed to be. And it's not supposed to be. I mean, they have it that way because that's the way society divided itself. Mm-hmm. So they came up with this idea. How about you start bringing some of your congregation over to the chapel? I'll start bringing some of chapel congregation over to Arlington Church of God. And why don't we just worship together? Now, look, let me be very careful here, because I don't want to give the impression that this is somehow some, quick fold and clean solution. If it were easy, we could just flip the switch and turn a dial. We would have done that already. This is very complicated. But what I'm saying is that these two church leaders, these two pastors, the first step they took was bringing people together in the hope that like-minded people claiming, both groups claiming a cross with a savior that hung on that cross and surrendering themselves to the reason why he hung on that cross. If those people had the integrity to do that and could live into that vision, then maybe that first step could start breaking down other areas, and maybe they might start doing things outside of church. But neither one of these men were under the impression that it was going to be like that, or that it would be easy.
What would be your recollection then for that experience? Like, was the worship style significantly different that you would have felt uncomfortable switching places, or would they have adapted it? Like, how might that have looked different?
I'll tell you what's happened when I've taken students in my slavery and race class.
Mm-hmm.
When I've taken them to my church, Messiah Missionary Baptist Church, and Pastor Rose has died a couple of years ago. But when he was, Pastor Rose came from a deep Southern family, and when the gospel choir got up to singing, when I took my students from slavery and race class, I really had a requirement. They had to come to church with me on a Sunday, and they did. And when they heard that black gospel choir singing, they looked like deer in headlights.
Yeah.
Like, wow, that's pretty loud. Yeah, it is. But it sounds good. But I would always kind of lean forward and look at their feet after like the first couple of refrains. You can see their feet tapping, and then they get up and start clapping. And I say, see how easy it is. So the worship styles are different, absolutely. And people argue about music and all that kind of stuff in church, irrespective of whether it be multicultural or not. But once you start learning other people and knowing other people, and you don't let things like worship styles, of course, are important, but you can navigate your way through those.
I agree.
And we eventually did that at Arlington. And my students tell me that I've had students writing to me years after going to Messiah, they say that was the best part of the class. Well, I used to take them to a soul food restaurant too. They said that was the best part of the class, but they say that the church experience is the most fun part of the class.
I just know that I am part of a faculty team that does conferences a couple times a year for Presbyterian Church USA. And I'm the only one on the team that doesn't have an MDiv. And we all have to take a turn giving a sermon during the week for our group worship. And we have an African-American retired pastor on our team who never stands and delivers his at the lectern, at the pulpit. He walks the whole time through as he's speaking, no notes, very passionate speaker. And he has this, I'm not exaggerating. I swear the Holy Spirit fills this man, and his knee just starts to go kind of, and it's just like, it's almost like an out of body experience. He's just that profound of a preacher. But I do sense that for some of the quote frozen chosen Presbyterians in the crowd, that it's a little bit new for them. But it's fun to watch. It's absolutely fascinating.
You know what? The only time that I ever heard that phrase, the frozen chosen,
yeah,
was during Marine Corps boot camp. They were talking about the Battle of the Chosen Reservoir during the Korean War. So when I first got up here, people said, with the frozen chosen, I said, well, I know I'm in Michigan, but what are you talking about? And they said they were talking about church folk. I went, okay, you know what? I'm gonna let you. that's what you're calling yourself. Okay.
Right.
I'm not gonna weigh in on that.
Yeah, scary term. All right, let's see. I think I have pretty much touched on everything. Of course, some additional compliments for how good this class is and how grateful we all are, as well as how helpful it is to examine our own experiences of systemic racism, to remove that, since many of us were raised in communities without much minorities. And thanking you for your insight and help with that. So
Sure.
that's everything.
I know we might have, there might be some points of information that intersect with that PBS special that you all are watching on the Black Church. I apologize for that, but I hope I'm also bringing some new stuff that maybe they haven't covered as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a comment in here that the PBS series is very good and helpful, but that your lectures are even better. So.
Great.
Professor Johnson,
Yes.
I have a comment.
Yes.
I grew up here in Dutch Holland, Michigan, Dutch ancestry, and then went to Hope College, majored in German, and went to Florida all my teaching career. For 42 years, I lived in South Florida.
Okay.
And a lot of that time I was in the United Methodist Church, which was an integrated church in a pretty much white area, but it was integrated. And my best friend is still a Black woman, we both sang in the choir. We had a lot of Black gospel anthems. I mean, it was great.
Mhm.
But what struck me the most, it was years after our friendship, we're still friends, and I would keep in touch with each other. It was years later that she said, well, you know why I liked sitting next to you in choir? And we sang the same second soprano. She said, I knew you were safe.
Wow.
We've developed a love for each other, but it's kind of hit me like your story in Africa. Wow, somebody has to think about that,
Yes.
that another person is safe for them to be around. That's something that I don't experience from my perspective very often. She's
Right.
still a dear friend in her 80s, late 80s, who acts like she'll be around, hundreds of years. She just has that kind of spunk about her. So I thank you very much for all of these lessons.
You're quite welcome. And I think, I know we get to go, but, I think that I just want to thank you all so much for wanting to even examine this subject, because, that cross and the person that died on it, that is the pathway to liberation and all kind of reconciliation and friendship and love and whatnot. But that symbol of the cross has been taken by people who have used it for some of the worst causes imaginable. So the duality of that, the thing that is a force of liberation and peace and reconciliation, can, in the wrong hands, can be used to generate hostility and confusion and division. And the one way of getting at that and examining that is to take it head on and re-examine it. I appreciate what you said about singing in the choir. I was going to sing for you all, but you all are friends, so I'm not going to do that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here and tuning in so faithfully. Thank you, Fred.
Take care.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day. Stay warm.
Bye, Half Scholars. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Hi,
Fred.
thank you, Fred.
Tom, I just got a question, Tom Glover, or Kit, if one of you want to check in with Fred about this, a person asking if he'll be discussing how music such as gospel or blues and jazz has influenced the church. I don't have the course description in front of me right now, so I can't remember if that's something he's going to cover or not. If not,
I'm looking at
it
it right now. I don't see it. I do not see it as part of his written outline.
Okay, if we could just make a note of it, it might be a fun
Yeah.
thing to do as a follow-up, either with him or with someone from the music department related to that might have some knowledge. Or
Correct. Yeah, I don't see it.
Okay.
So good question.
Might be a good idea for a summer class.
Yeah. Yeah.